big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leis.
Well, it's May 9, 2024, the year of our Lord, and welcome everybody to this live discussion. I'm very excited about today because we have a very special guest, Chris Bloomer, and I'll get to him in a moment. We're going to talk about Canada's energy picture, specifically from our oil and gas industries, about pipelines, and we're going to talk about a very interesting project you may have heard. It's called the Trans Mountain Pipeline Project. So we're going to talk about that story, the incredible origins of the story, things that you may not have heard, but that thing is coming on stream. This month, it's literally filling up with Canadian product, and it's going to go around the world to people who desperately need Canadian energy. So I want to start off by welcoming you, the audience, and welcome your questions and feedback as usual. We really do appreciate it. We get so many comments from you, and we really do appreciate it. And it's interesting to read people's feedback around your questions, but also what I sense is an awful lot of care and concern for our country. So we really do appreciate it. So from all of us here on the Frontier, keep it coming. We really do appreciate that kind of feedback. So on May the 9th, we see the Trans Mountain Project coming forward. So we've got a clip to introduce a little bit about the background of this project.
Seated on the shores of Burrard Inlet, Will George reflects on years of activism against the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion.
You know, these are spiritual highways. This is what sustained our people for thousands of years. So, you know, all the direct action that I was called to do over the years was a high honor.
Despite the best efforts of George and other activists, Trans Mountain says this photo shows what it is calling the Golden Weld, completing the 1,100-kilometer pipeline from Alberta to a coastal terminal in Burnaby. Proponents of the project say it is a key piece of infrastructure which will provide a boost to Canada's oil industry, contributing to job growth, royalties, and corporate taxes.
These broader economic benefits of infrastructure like this is perhaps the most important implication of the project now coming online.
The expansion of the existing Trans Mountain pipeline allows close to 900,000 barrels of oil per day to flow to the export terminal. But that capacity comes at a cost. The federal government bought the project from Kinder Morgan in 2018 for $4.5 billion. During construction, the total cost ballooned to $34 billion, which works out to $873 per person in Canada.
There's no question we have some problems here in this country around building some major infrastructure. And as much as it's a day to celebrate, it's also a day to reflect we really can do better than this.
The project has overcome the cost overruns, fierce opposition. The Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations took the fight all the way to the Supreme Court, where they were ultimately unsuccessful.
We're going to be here for quite some time.
George and other activists actually suspended themselves beneath the Ironworkers Memorial Bridge in 2018, and he spent 28 days in jail for violating a court injunction.
Puts a lump in my throat. It's hard to know work that my nation did, that I did, and the people of Vancouver still didn't arise to protecting our lands and waters. It's still at a huge risk right now.
To give you an idea of just how big of a lightning rod this project still is, it is opening with no ribbon cuttings, no photo ops, no public fanfare of any kind. Ben Milger, CTV News, Vancouver.
So there you have it, the opening of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. You've got kind of in that report, that segment, a reflection on the incredible journey that pipeline project has had in terms of roadblocks, but also the incredible benefits that this will have for every Canadian. So on that note, I want to welcome my special guest, Chris Bloomer. Chris Bloomer is a experienced energy executive. He's also the former CEO of the Canadian Pipelines Association. He's also a board member at the Frontier Center for Public Policy. And I can think of few better people to talk with when it comes to reflecting on the importance of this pipeline project, Canadian Energy, because Chris, you've had a, dare I say, a front row seat when it comes to this pipeline project over the years. Is that correct?
Yep, close enough to get hit by a puck.
Okay. So when did you first hear about the Trans Mountain Pipeline project? I'm curious.
Well, really, I joined CEPA, the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association, in the end of 2015, and it was coincidental with the election of Justin Trudeau.
Hmm.
And, so it was around that post, and it was I think in 2013 it was Kinder Morgan made their submission to the NEB, and then it was subsequently approved by the NEB in 2016 and by uh, the Trudeau government in 2016. So it was right at the beginning of the whole story.
Okay, so the NEB being the National Energy Board, is that correct?
Yeah, at the time it was National Energy Board. Yeah,
Okay. So you've seen this unfold over a span of, gosh, some 10 years.
yeah.
Um, and help us lay out the picture during that time in 2015, because there were a lot of other major pipeline projects in play at the time. I remember Energy East that was going to take energy all the way from the oil sands all the way to the East Coast.
Hmm.
There was, of course, the Keystone XL project, which was going to take energy products to the south. There was a number of other ones. Can you help explain why that kind of infrastructure is so important for the industry?
Well, the context is that there's a need and a continuing need for energy in the world. Uh,
Hmm.
we just need more energy. We add more people in the world every day, and
Hmm.
those people need energy. And Canada, if you look at it, compare it to other countries, is in terms of resources, certainly oil resources, has the greatest amount of oil available to be produced in the world. And
Sorry,
that's
can you repeat that again, Chris? Because I don't hear this very often.
yeah. Well, our resources are enormous, and we are within the top three. I would say Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Canada are in the top three
Hmm.
uh, of oil in the ground that can be developed. So it's around 180 billion barrels of oil is available
Unbelievable.
to be developed. It's it's a gift. It's a treasure.
Hmm. Well, and what I find fascinating is that you reference those other oil producers, and there's a whole list of them, including
Hmm.
Russia, that um, if you think of the quality and the level of innovation and care for the environment, where would Canada rank among those oil producers, the competitors, if you will, of oil producing countries in the world, Chris?
Right at or near the top. There's no on every measure that you look at Canadian energy production, we do it the best in the world on every
Indeed.
environmental, social, respect for the land, technology, um, and continuous improvement, and key amongst that is safety.
Indeed. So we should be celebrating that. So if you, as a Canadian, our audience, if that's new to you, spread the word, get it out there that Canadians are among the best producers of energy, both oil and gas, certainly in the world. On the other side, I think another side of this, Chris, is you allude a lot to the demand for energy. Is
Yeah.
demand falling off in terms of oil, or is it continuing to go up?
Well, the fact is, it's going up. Um, an interesting statistic is that in 2023, I think it was the demand for oil globally was around 103, 104 million barrels a day. That accounts for, on an annual basis, every person on Earth uses 5 barrels of oil a year. So
Wow.
that is when you put it down at that level, the importance of that energy is unparalleled, and the fact that that energy over time has created uh, a living standard globally and lifted up populations globally to where it is now. So it's still going to be needed in the future. In fact, it's still going to go up. Forecasts are 110 million barrels a day in the near future. Um, and this oil is not globally is getting harder and harder and more costly to find. And what we have in Canada is a resource that can be developed and produced over decades.
Okay, so what's really driving this demand in energy? I mean, we've got the burgeoning economies of China
Right.
and India. Does that pretty well explain it all?
Well, in that example of how much oil a person, each individual in the world uses annually, is a reflection that the population is not shrinking. The population is growing. So there's a growing demand for energy and all forms of energy. So that's the key driver of energy
Hmm.
demand. And as time goes on, I think the big picture wise, we're going to need all the energy that we can get from every source, and oil and natural gas, things that Canada has in massive abundance to supply the world, is going to be needed and is going to be developed, and it's going to help with the standard of living globally.
Exactly. And if you're extracting that energy in a sound, ethical manner, and I think you and so many others, I think of Gwen Morgan as an example, the former CEO of Canada,
Hmm.
and I mean, there's just so many of them. You can really show how Canadians are certainly among the best, if not the best in the world when it comes to this. So there's a huge burgeoning market. So why wouldn't we as Canadians be right there getting this incredible product to the market? I mean, this is incredible for
Yeah.
human life, and so that's really the context why this project was built or expanded. Is that right?
Yeah, there for sure. I mean, the pipeline, the original pipeline was built in 1953,
Hmm.
and it was expanded. Uh, I think 10 years ago or so. But there was an expansion to the pipeline that got approved and developed without any fanfare. And then
Hmm.
the big expansion came along, which follows the route of the original pipeline, and that was deemed to be by the proponent at the time, Kinder Morgan. Um, we call it market pull. There's a market pull for that project because the market needed and wanted that oil, and Canada had it available. So on a commercial basis at the time, it made eminent sense for that pipeline to be designed and proposed to be developed to
Hmm.
to feed that market pull for the oil.
Indeed. So the market was there, an existing pipeline was there. It was recently expanded, but the markets are have major demands. So the idea of tripling the size of this existing pipeline really made a lot of sense.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's you alluded to other pipeline projects during this period of time, and if you look back to, let's say, the early 2000s to the to now and the early teens, the whole evolution of the energy picture in Canada has changed an awful lot.
Hmm. So when you look at the context now of the opening of this pipeline, literally this month, can you tell us a little bit more about the process of opening one of these giant pipelines and how many people it employed? What is that kind of process like, Chris?
Well, during the construction of it, there's you know ultimately peaking at I think it's maybe 16,000 people or maybe more have worked
Hmm.
on the pipeline. It's a tremendous engineering feat, and that's there's a bit of sadness around this, as was mentioned in the clip at the beginning, that there was no fanfare. It wasn't treated
Yeah.
as an accomplishment on a grand scale of a major
Hmm.
project, and that's really sad because
It really is.
the best of our engineering, the best of what the people could bring to the table to put in place the proper agreements with First Nations so that they benefit from it, and that the respect for the land is there. the best environmental practices, the best management practices, all of that, irrespective of where the cost went. But it is a massive engineering and technical feat that should be celebrated. And it's
Indeed.
unfortunate that was not the case.
Yeah, so this is what I find sometimes really hard to understand because I had the pleasure of talking with some of the supervisors on the construction of the
Hmm.
pipeline. And it is incredible the kind of detail and care they took in terms of protecting the environment as they built this massive project. It's an
Yeah,
engineering feat. It's hard to really comprehend. Even if you look in the map, it's hard to understand the challenging topography and the distances
yeah,
involved. It is really a marvel of engineering. But in that context, what I also recall so well, because in a previous life I was involved with an organization that had a real interest in the benefit agreements to every community, including First Nations,
hmm,
all the way along that pipeline. Like the level of discussions and negotiations and the enthusiasm from
yeah.
First Nations all along that route was very positive. And yet it's interesting because the clip that we showed kind of led with a fellow, and he has every right to protest and all the rest. But it's interesting again, it led with the opposition to the project that was so
Hmm.
visible, when in fact, on the ground, most First Nations were thoroughly in favor of this project. Is that a fair comment, Chris?
Well, I agree with that comment, and it's even more true today because those communities, they see these types of developments as a an economic boost. It's a way for them to
Hmm.
develop. It's a way for them to develop skills, both technical, managerial, financial. It builds their communities that way. So
Hmm.
it is for those communities. It is something that is extremely valuable and hard to replace if you don't have those projects. So in the Trans Mountain project, it was conceived and developed and brought into service during a really historic time in terms of how social policy, indigenous policy,
Mm.
economic policy. It was really a watershed kind of environment where, and regulatory policy too, where things were in flux. Things were changing. People were, and the government, certainly the federal government, was pushing dramatic changes in the view of climate,
Hmm.
indigenous relationships, and responsibility. So it occurred at a time when all those forces were there. But at the end of the day, what Trans Mountain did, and I don't think enough credit can be given to Ian Anderson, who was the CEO at the time. He
Hmm.
led the Indigenous engagement. He led the negotiation of those agreements. He led
Hmm.
the building of the goodwill, and really is an example of how things are done properly. And that element needs to be celebrated too, because
Indeed.
when we get things right, we should say we got that right, and that's a good thing. And during that in that environment, it necessitated really relooking at things, which is good, but we did it right in the end. And it's interesting to note, though, that in that whole piece, I mentioned earlier that it was originally approved by the NEB, which is now the CER, Canadian Energy Regulator, and then it was approved by the Trudeau government, and then the project was taken to court, and it was deemed that, unbelievably, that the federal government had not lived up to their responsibility for proper consultation with Indigenous groups. So the whole
So
project had to get stopped.
the court ruled ironically that it's the federal government that didn't do its
Correct.
job.
The federal government did not have adequate consultation with the First Nations uh, uh, through the approval process that they ultimately approved the pipeline. So that was a key piece of the project, but it
Hmm.
is very ironic that happened and that stalled the project. and the
Wow.
government had to go back and redo its consultation with the help of Trans Mountain, and then eventually they got it right at that time, but the company got it right all along. So it really is, again, kind of a sad commentary on the situation at the time.
So let's just, get some reality therapy here. You had this company, Trans Mountain, that had its investors together, the engineering wherewithal, the
Hmm.
commitment to build one of the most significant pipelines in North America.
Right.
And they, I think what you noted is really quite significant. During this time, 2015, you had a change of federal government. You had a lot of convergence of
Hmm.
parties that wanted, let's be frank, they wanted to stop this pipeline no matter what it would take, right? They were bound
Right.
and determined to do that, despite the fact that this company was doing its due diligence, doing its work. You had Ian Anderson working and creating all this goodwill with First
Hmm.
Nations, and
Yep.
they're coming along, and there's all these parties come forward. It's almost like there was a concerted, coordinated, well-funded campaign. This is what I'm observing, Chris, as a layperson interested, obviously, in public policy, to stop a very important project that would benefit both the community and every Canadian. It's really quite a saga, is it not?
It is, and it's a complex situation where you have uh, it comes down to the bitumen resources and the mining and the extraction, both on surface and subsurface of the bitumen, and creating the oil in that manner. And it really started with the backlash and the environmental protests on the oil sands and developing the oil sands. So
Hmm.
it started off
Mhm.
even earlier with the production side of it, and then the demonization of the industry carried on, and it became a convenient tool that you're producing this product that is going to ruin the world rather than
Mhm.
help the world, and it's being produced in a responsible manner, and continuously improving that manner,
Mhm.
and putting it in a pipeline and shipping it out, and somebody's going to use it. Well, that shift from the production side of it to the pipeline side
Mhm.
was a way to try to not have those projects go ahead, and on environmental basis, and the fact that you're producing a bad product, now you're going to put it in a pipeline, and if it spills, it's going to be an environmental disaster of epic proportions. So
Mhm.
that's the environment that things were cast, and for the
Mhm.
longest time, and one of the biggest issues with pipelines was they're not safe. I mean, there have been some serious pipeline spills
Mhm.
in the recent past. Enbridge's spill, was diluted bitumen. That was a problem. That enabled people to say, "See there, that's what's going to happen." But
Mhm.
there again, Enbridge handled that and through everything they had to fix it and learn from that.
Mhm.
And it even got to the point where the prime minister said, pipelines are safe at some point, which was very
Mhm.
helpful.
Well, indeed, pipelines are safe. They're not
They
perfect.
are.
No transportation system is. But you can't tell me that you are going to choose railway cars to transport oil. And I'm not saying that they're unsafe because they generally are, but that is the risks are much higher for that kind of mode of transport than pipelines. I mean, everybody knows this. And so all of a sudden
Yeah.
you've got this vilification. I think you used the word demonization of not only the industry, but really this pipeline. It's really kind of pathetic, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Again, in the context of the times, you mentioned that the funding of these activists and these environmental groups,
Hmm.
and there was so much of it going on. There's been a lot of discussion of who was funding these people, and what was going on and so on. But the fact is, there was outside influence in that. But no matter that, the fact is that there was this activism, and people have a right to demonstrate and so on. But it really cast the energy industry in a very, very bad light that was, very unfair
Hmm.
and uncalled for. So it tilted the landscape to make it even more difficult just to do the things that we were doing on a day-to-day basis, let alone propose new projects and get them built.
Indeed. Yeah, the engineering is tough enough as
Yeah,
itself, but
yeah,
let alone managing all these activists that are coming out and well funded, as you say, by the usual suspects, including the Tides Foundation out of California, of all places, just facilitating all this nonsense.
yeah.
So, one thing I did want to pick up on then is just help us understand the story, if you will. And by the way, I'm speaking again with the former CEO of the Canadian Pipeline Association, Chris Bloomer, and we're talking about the Trans Mountain Pipeline as that comes on stream this month. What do you think? Please let us know your questions. We'd love to hear from you. Um, so help us understand it. How did it become a privately owned pipeline project to one that, ironically, the federal
Mhm,
government, which is intent on really, in effect, shutting down the oil and gas industry, ends up
mhm.
buying it? How did that happen, Chris?
Well, you referenced earlier in your comments around other pipeline projects that were proposed and did not get anywhere. Northern Gateway was one, and
Hmm.
that was at the same time that the original approval of Trans Mountain, they denied the approval for Northern Gateway. That was one pipeline. Then there was, as you say, Energy East. There was the KXL that eventually, you know, was not approved by the U.S. government. So there was those things going on at the time.
So, in that context, what happened? Kinder Morton just said, look, this is too
Right.
much. We're going to get out of it. This is
Well,
done, right?
yeah, you had that situation where they approved initially Trans Mountain and denied these other projects. And then there was another change of government. Just happened to be the case in BC, where you had the Horgan NDPs come in, and you had
Yes, indeed.
uh, uh, Environmental Minister Heyman, who was from the Sierra Fund, come in, and they really ramped it up in the sense that they were not going to allow this pipeline to be built.
Hmm.
They were going to use, the worn out phrase, every tool in their toolbox to prevent it from happening.
Yes. Even
They
though they
put
knew it wasn't going to work.
right, but time is money. Delay, 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 and in fact, it worked.
Exactly.
Uh, the uh, the uh, the other tack they took was that they deemed the bitumen was a toxic substance, and they were going to ban it from being transported across the province. So that created this whole environment of activism and governments putting in roadblocks and so on.
Hmm.
So at that time, Kinder Morgan made the decision not to proceed with the project, which was, from a commercial and business point of view, money hates uncertainty, and you see that in the stock market, you see it everywhere. Well,
Hmm.
if a company cannot calculate the execution risk of a project, that is extreme uncertainty. So at the time, with certainly with the NDP in BC coming in and really uh, going to town on resisting the pipeline, that created this uncertainty that the company could not calculate. It was just too much risk for the company. So they said, we're going to stop. We're not going to do this because we cannot determine how much time, how much money, and if we can't do that without reasonable probability, we can't do it. So that was what
Indeed.
really led to their decision not to proceed with it. And then, I'm not sure what happened in the government hallways, but they stepped up and bought the pipeline. And I think that, in the context of denying so many other projects that were greenfields or needed to create a new right of way and so on, and the Trans Mountain Pipeline already had the right of way, and I think they were compelled to take on the pipeline and proceed with it.
So they, as I recall, the federal government purchased the entire lock, stock, and barrel of the project for some, what was it, 4.6, $4.7 billion.
Hmm.
And now we know that the costs are coming in. I haven't seen a kind of a fully accounted uh, cost of the project is somewhere around $34 billion.
Right.
So a lot of escalated costs there. Do you have a sense of why those costs increase so much?
Well, a couple of things. First thing is they bought an operating pipeline that was shipping about 300,000 barrels a day, 360,000 barrels a day of oil and refined products. So they bought an operating pipeline, and they bought a project. They bought a mega project, and if you look at all the mega projects, certainly in Canada, you look at Site C,
Hmm.
you look at Muskrat Falls, you look at uh, even in the oil sands, the major mining projects that were developed. All these major projects have significant, kind of eye-watering cost overruns as a normal course. And then when you throw in all of the uh, activism, the political dynamics of executing this project, it became even more costly because we had delays. They bought the pipeline, but then they had to go back because the federal government didn't, you know, adequately consult with First Nations.
Hmm.
That created some time issues. You had numerous environmental issues. The one that I remember was around a hummingbird nest where the company had cleared right away that they were approved to clear. And just to show you the kind of intensity of observation by activists and so on, they had people out there watching what was going on, looking for any uh, problem or any issue that the company had created to report it. And it just so happened that they cut down a tree that had a hummingbird's nest in it. And I don't know if you've seen a hummingbird's nest, but the bird itself is very small and the nest is very small.
It's very tiny,
So
yes.
very tiny. And so they notified the environment. They shut down the project for that uh, for a period of time to enable, if just in case there was any other nests around. That piece of delay. I'm not saying hummingbirds aren't important. I love hummingbirds, but that
Yes.
delay cost $100 million
A
for that
hundred
hummingbird.
million dollars.
$100 million for that delay. So that's just two examples of one, the scrutiny that this pipeline was under all throughout its execution. You had people observing, watching, looking for any mistake whatsoever, and the cost that any sort of delay can have on the project. Now, also, you had COVID. COVID was a big issue,
Hmm.
and during that time, getting people in camps, getting people, skilled workers into sites, that had a major impact on the cost. You can't forget that. That was a significant cost. And then you had the floods during the time, and shut down the existing pipeline and shut down the construction of the new expansion. But here again, Trans Mountain uh, mustered because it cut off gasoline supply to Vancouver,
Hmm.
and Trans Mountain used its best efforts to get gasoline from Washington State into Vancouver on barges to
I do
backstop them,
remember that.
and the
Yes.
company did that, and a tremendous effort on that. And you remember the price of gasoline went through the roof, and it kind of showed
I
you
do remember.
how important the price gasoline was. So there
Yeah.
was that issue, and there was other delays going along. So major projects like this, which is a huge, this is an
Hmm.
enormous project in Canadian history.
Hmm.
And
It really
and
is.
and any kind of time delay on that creates cost overruns. So unfortunately, that's the situation with Trans Mountain.
No, Chris, I want to thank you for helping to remind us of these twists and turns of this project. I mean, that's just one arguably small glimpse into it. And it is really remarkable how vulnerable this part of the country on the West Coast is to energy vulnerability. I mean, if that pipeline is down, we really have to bring in energy from the United States. So, I mean, there's strategic issues here when it comes to people's
100%.
life and safety. And so
Yeah.
it's like, where is the rational adults in the room with the pants on who are going to say, look, we have to go ahead with this project and we have to think about everybody's security and welfare? Because I look at the list that you've alluded to, the roadblocks are stunning, between diversity, equity, inclusion requirements on the project, to the whole issue of further consultation on the Indigenous side, to C69, the
Yeah.
so-called Never Any Pipelines bill, uh, efforts on the environmental side, net zero, to lawsuits. I mean, you had ironically, a BC government, the Horgan NDP government, using, as you said, every tool in their toolkit to take the law out, even though they knew. And we've seen now the internal memos confirming that they had no hope um,
No.
in no possibility of winning these lawsuits, and yet they went ahead with it, all to delay. So I do have a question from the audience then. So, in light of this story of the pipeline, what does this do to Canada's reputation as a place to invest, Chris?
Uh, Unfortunately, I mean, you see it in the commentary for quite a period of time now, that Canada has lost its position. Um, Canada was seen as a safe, sober country where you could develop projects that were developed properly, that created wealth and quality of life, and it was seen as an example of how we can do things, and an example of how we can develop our resources, to now where, not just in the oil and gas sector,
Hmm.
in all sectors, uh, Canada's not seen as the place to invest right now. We have tremendous issues, tremendous problems. We have flight of capital, flight of people, and our way of life. I'm not trying to be, you know, engage in hyperbole, but our way of life is kind of in jeopardy because of that. Because um, the cost to run the government now, because of the debt, you think of what we need to do to fund that, is incredible. It's really difficult. So Canada is tarnished in that regard. It's not because of the people. It's not because of
Hmm.
the engineers. It's not because of the people that work to build things. It's because of bad public policy, bad policy,
Hmm.
and 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 deferring to outside forces that are trying to drive an agenda around DEI
Hmm.
and all these other things. So we need to learn to think for ourselves and think of in our own interests.
I think you're absolutely right, Chris. So let's take some sobering lessons from the opening of this incredible project. Let's celebrate the benefits, the accomplishments, but let's also learn from these lessons. So one of the questions I have for you then, Chris, and you've been in the industry in so many respects as a leader, is what would be your vision for energy, oil and gas, for this incredible country? Where do you think we could be if we really got the policy right, the commitment, the courage, if you will, to action to move this country forward? What would be your vision, Chris?
Yeah, it's a vision that looks at it from a very pragmatic, but also a critical thinking perspective. Pragmatic in the sense that we have an enormous resource base in all respects. We have enormous hydropower. We have enormous uranium resources. We have other natural resources like wind and solar. Those are all great, and they're part of the puzzle. But the
Hmm.
strength that we have is in the skills that we have to develop resources in the mining sector and in the oil and gas sector. And we
Hmm.
have massive resources that we can exploit and develop. And we shouldn't think of that as being like dirty work, like we only want to be
Hmm.
programmers and so on. This is highly, highly technical work.
Hmm.
Artificial intelligence is going to play a massive role in developing these resources and make them even better and more sustainable in the future. So we need to really highlight and understand what we have and what we're good at to be able to develop those resources. And that takes some critical thinking about um, what we're good at and what we're not good at, and the nature of this country, because the resources are not just in one spot. They're spread across north,
Hmm.
south, east, and west, and we need to think about it as on a whole basis. And the fact that we want to maximize what we have for the benefit of the country. We want to bring in people from all over the world. Well, we have to be able to have the resources, the facilities, the buildings, the housing, the medical system to be able to enable that. But we can't do it if we don't develop and use what we have to the maximum.
Right on. What strikes me about this conversation with you, Chris, as well, is bluntly, it's almost like Canadians take our oil and gas industry for granted and don't understand it as really being the number one foundational industry in our country at this juncture. And they don't realize that it's actually underdeveloped. And I'm wondering if we could pursue that line of discussion a little bit. Underdeveloped, I would say, in a number of respects, not only in terms of your overview that there is so much that Canada can offer the world in terms of energy, the quantity and the quality that we offer, but also the fact is, and this is where the Trans Mountain comes in, we have an energy discount. In other words, the Canadians, we leave a ton of money on the table. And I want you to
Yeah,
help me
yeah,
understand this better, Chris. Because we have one primary, not the only, but really one primary customer, namely the United States, we don't get full market price. We don't get full world market price. I mean, this is outrageous. So because we can't get our product out to Tidewater, whether that's through Trans Mountain or
hmm
whether it's through, projects like to Port Nelson or Churchill, whatever you want to say,
yeah.
we're kind of being ripped off. Is that true, Chris?
Well, that's been the case for a long long time before the Trans Mountain Pipeline came along. Our natural gas resources relied on one customer, and going through that whole deregulation period in natural gas, we were not getting what we should have for the gas. But a really telling example of the impact of the way things were was when before Trans Mountain, um, our oil was competing uh, in the U.S. with Venezuelan oil, with
Hmm.
Mexican oil. We were competing in the U.S. with a global market that we didn't have access to. So we always paid a discount with respect to. There was always a major discount against the WTI price. Also because of quality too, but fundamentally we were competing in a global market without having access to
Hmm.
a global market.
Hmm.
And that really came to a head a few years ago when, and there was always this issue of we could produce more than the pipelines could take away. And this goes back a long ways. And they had
Hmm.
a system uh, on the called apportionment, where you could only take a portion of the crude that was available. Well, that created a massive discounting of the price because you
Hmm.
couldn't put all the oil into the pipeline. The second thing was that uh, as the oil sands projects ramped up and so on in the recent past, the government actually shut in production because the differential got so wide that it became almost uneconomic to produce. And that
Wow.
was
So
before the
what
Trans
was
Mountain
that
Pipeline.
differential, Chris? Like, what is there a kind of a quantum that you could give us?
Yeah, the kind of at this the normal differential is, it's seasonal, it's 13, 14, $15 a barrel off of
Hmm.
WTI. But you were getting into the 20s, pushing into the 30s. It was like doubling of the differential at the time.
Hmm.
So the government, I think rightfully so, decided that we're not going to give our product, our oil away. So we're gonna leave it in the ground, which is never a good thing, and it's to help balance the market off. Well, that's a key example of where we got to, in that we were not able to produce or to move what we produce, and that's when rail became a thing in Canada too. Like it was
Hmm.
any way out of town was the way to go. So uh, Trans Mountain has mitigated that,
Hmm.
but to an extent. But there are studies and there's analysis out just even today, uh, where they're saying, yeah, Trans Mountain's great and it's going to soak up excess production, but producers are going to produce more, and we could see ourselves in a situation where we would be tight takeaway capacity in the near future, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. But it also points to the fact that we can produce a lot more than we're doing now. We just need to have access to markets. So that whole discussion is going to come back on the table, and with the policies on caps on emissions and so on, we're still going to see a significant amount of incremental oil production come to the table.
Hmm. Okay, so this whole larger debate about where we're going as a country with the energy, oil and gas from Canada to the world is not going to go away. This debate is not going to go away.
Well, it's
And
well, it's let me just
right,
comment on that. It's not going to go away because the demand for those products are not going to go away globally, and the
precisely.
economic
Yes.
impact that those products have on Canada is huge. And we're
Yeah.
in a situation where we're going to need that.
Yeah. And to be blunt, we're leaving money on the table, and this is not an insignificant amount. This is worth hundreds of billions of dollars for this
Of
country.
course, of course.
And this would transform the standard of living for every Canadian. And shame on any decision maker, gatekeeper, decision maker, whoever you want to call it, activist group that's funded by all these foreign foundations, is undermining the future of our country, because this is going to change the lifestyle, the standard of living, and the quality of life for every Canadian,
Yeah.
period.
Well, unfortunately, when you look at um, just the productivity numbers in Canada versus the U.S., we are way off,
Indeed.
and that has a tag along economic impact. So if you're not attracting capital, if you're not building
Hmm.
industries, if you're not taking advantage of the resources that you have at hand to build industries, then you're going to decline.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the stats where, Ontario alone, the average
Yeah.
income of a family is almost $20,000 less than the average in the United States. It's like almost on par with Mississippi. It's pathetic. And then you look at our declining
Yeah.
productivity. This is a tale of a nation that's on a decline that we've got to recognize and get a hold of and turn this around. And this whole pipeline is really a symptom of that decline. Is that maybe another way to see it, Chris?
Well, it is in terms of what went on and how long it took and how much it cost and so on. But the pipeline cost $34 billion, and maybe this is not an apples to apples comparison, but
Hmm.
if you look at recent federal government um, pronouncements and initiatives, they're willing to shell out well over $30 billion to subsidize the development of battery plants in
Hmm.
Ontario and Quebec.
Yes. Wow.
So compare that, and will that technology really that they're going to build, is that going to be the technology of the future? I don't know. another technology might come along, but they're willing to risk the cost of that pipeline that's going to generate billions of dollars of revenue, and we know that,
Hmm.
and it's economic, and it's going to uplift the country against something that you're going to have to subsidize into existence, and that's a real dilemma.
So I have another question from the audience, and it is, are you optimistic we can ever build another pipeline again in this country?
Well, I answered that in my Senate comments in a way, where I said, "Never say never," but it's going to be a challenge. Again, capital does not like uncertainty and risk, and capital will flow where it has the best chance to invest and get a return. So
Mhm.
right now, uh, I don't believe that anybody is going to propose a new pipeline in the very near future. Now, if you look at what's happened recently, ATCO has committed to build a $2 billion pipeline to bring gas into the Alberta heartland for petrochemicals and so on. There's a
Mm.
big demand for that, um, and that's great. But in terms of accessing world markets with our products and building new pipelines for that, it's still going to be a challenge, and it still is. We'll see how the ATCO pipeline goes, and hopefully it goes very smoothly. But it's going to be a real challenge for industry and outside investment to um, take a risk on Canada to build that major infrastructure.
Mm.
So you need the right conditions in place for industry and proponents to step up and take the risk of proposing a new pipeline.
Mhm.
And the market pull, as I said very early on, the market pull is going to be there for that. The market pull is going to be there for the LNG.
Mhm.
Coastal GasLink
Indeed.
pipeline got built. So I would say in the near future, it's going to be very, very challenging for
Mhm.
new major transmission, like cross provincial boundaries and getting it to tidewater and so on. It's going to be it's the probability is very low.
It's kind of a sad statement, Chris, and I certainly respect your background and experience that, it looks kind of grim, certainly under current policies or current governments. So I guess the question I have is, how do we work together as Canadians to change this? This is really a major choice that Canadians are making, and maybe they're not even fully aware of this, and hence the importance of this kind of discussion. But it
Yeah.
strikes me that so many Canadians are just simply not aware of what's at stake. They think it's all about the quote environment, that we have this imminent threat that we're all going to disappear, like Greta Thunberg, constantly warns us about. Um, and they don't realize that the quality of our country and the opportunity to actually serve the rest of the world by serving those energy needs is at
Right.
stake. Um, I am really concerned that people don't seem to get the bigger picture that we have a current federal government. If you look at all these policies, they want to shut it all down. They want to shut down oil and gas. And it begs for me the question that, are these decision makers totally delusional when it comes to understanding the nature of these energy needs, but that these policies are actually about short-term political thinking rather than anything that's based on any real policy?
Well, they have a real policy, and the real policy is to move away as quickly as possible from oil and gas. But here's the you know the the population is busy with their day to day. They're busy with uh, all the things that they need to do to get the kids to school, to make supper, to
Indeed.
go out camping and all that kind of stuff. That's what they're focused on, and that's what that's part of having a good quality of life. But the pernicious aspect of the policies, like forcing green initiatives, where yeah, the technology is there, but it's not really there commercially, and you got to
Hmm.
subsidize it into existence and so on. it increases the cost of living. It increases the cost of energy where we don't need to. And
Hmm.
we've forced this onto our country, and it's increasing the cost of living, is increasing the things
Indeed.
that people want to do on a day-to-day basis. And um, you know, a strong economy is built on a low cost and efficient uh, sources of energy, and that's the one thing in terms of policy that needs to be reoriented. Doing all these other things without calculating and understanding the ultimate cost. I mean,
Hmm.
Ontario went through that with the Wynne government in terms of
Yes.
all of this, and it was disastrous. I mean, people couldn't heat their homes, they couldn't bake their bread, they
Hmm.
and so it creeps up on people. And my suggestion is to try to be a little bit more aware. And I'm not criticizing, but I'm saying it's important that these government policies get scrutinized. Like you mentioned, Bill C-69. That was
Hmm.
a massive overreach by the federal government to control the development of major projects in Canada. It's something that
Yes.
CEPA fought along with others right to the last minute. And I took away from that I didn't really think that the policymakers wanted to go as drastically and as far as they did.
Hmm.
And but now I do. I wish I'd taken that a lot more seriously. That in a sense they were willing to do anything it took to get their policy agenda forward, because that's what all that mattered, because it was lockstep with UN policy, WEF policy, World Economic Forum
Hmm.
policy, the extreme climate agenda, and so on, rather than thinking of what's in our best interest, thinking pragmatically and continuously improving what we do. And we don't want a destroyed environment, but we want a quality of life, and we want a cost of life that is not a constant struggle.
I think you're right on, and that, safe, dependable,
Yes.
reliable, and inexpensive energy is really uh, an ace card for the Canadian standard of living. So instead of ruining that, let's build it up and
Yes.
take advantage of it for the sake of everybody, including the world. Um,
Well, and
you
I
know,
think, just one last comment, I think we should be proud of what we do. We should
indeed.
honor what we do. We have learned and we've come a long way, and that's part of the continuous improvement. We've learned from Trans Mountain, and that will affect how we do things going forward, and we need to celebrate that.
Well, let's celebrate that this month as the Trans Mountain Pipeline opens. And I guess the final question I'm going to ask as we kind of wrap up our far-reaching discussion, Chris, is what can citizens do when we look at this type of situation? We have all kinds of opportunity. Canada's an incredible country with lots of opportunity, and case in point, our oil and gas industry. What can Canadians do to help move this agenda forward?
Yeah, it's really there's so many things have gone on in so many levels that I think that uh, I people need try and be optimistic about things. That we
Hmm.
do have a great country, that we do have great people, we do have great technology and resources, but we need to um, again celebrate that, and also to expect our governments to try to maximize the value in the most efficient way of that, so that my lifestyle, my cost of living does not get trashed because of policies that are not productive, not economic, and are just serving another purpose.
Right on. So let's be aware as citizens. Let's share this program with others. That would be good. Um, let's speak up, make those phone calls to your elected representatives. That's important to do that. And let's celebrate this month as the Trans Mountain Pipeline opens. And I just want to thank you, Chris, for all your leadership over the years. You've, as we said earlier, had a front row seat, but also you made a big difference as a leader within an industry association to try to speak up and deal with a very challenging environment. So I hope you feel, in many ways, proud of this day as well.
Yeah, I feel I feel privileged to be a part of it and to contribute in any small way, and I am proud, and I take my hat off to all those people that built this infrastructure and are building other infrastructure. Um, they're really the heroes of this story.
Well said, Chris. And I'm glad that we could have this discussion
Thank
together and
you.
also with our audience. And so
Much
please,
appreciated.
well, it's been an honor. And so all the best to you, Chris, and also to the members of our audience. We thank you for those questions, and we thank you for continuing to join us. And be sure to join us next week, this Thursday at the same time and same place.
Take care. Thank you.